Hey, everyone. So, back up until about 2014, this is how I wrote all my CSS. The way that I would build stuff is I would open an HTML file, write all the markup that I needed for the feature that I was trying to implement, and when I was satisfied with that, drop in a couple sort of class names as hooks, jump over to the CSS file, and then figure out how to select all that HTML and style it however I needed to style it. And it worked in the sense that the pixels that were rendered on the screen were the pixels that were in the design, generally. But no matter how hard I tried to keep my CSS organized, try to make things maintainable, rules and guidelines that we implemented on our teams to keep things under control, the CSS in every project I worked on was always the first thing to just spiral completely out of control into this unmaintainable spider web of fucking bullshit that everyone on the team was afraid to touch. So around that time, 2014, I decided to kind of just like make it my mission to figure out what the hell I was doing wrong and what I had to do to come up with style sheets that I could revisit 3, 4, 5, 6 months later and still feel confident in the changes that I was going to be making to the project, because simply just didn't have that. So I started just consuming every bit of content I could find on the internet about writing awesome CSS, watching every conference talk that I could find, reading every book, buying every course, reading every CSS tricks article on CSS architecture. And then one day I stumbled across this article by this guy, Nicholas Gallagher, who's the creator of Normalized CSS and was working at Twitter at the time, called About HTML Semantics and Front-End Architecture. And in that article, he makes the argument that the most reusable components are those with class names that are independent of the content. And that instead of writing classes like this, that sort of describe the block of HTML, like the thing that we're building, that we then jump over to our CSS and hook into in style, that we should be writing classes more like this, like card, that just like describe the visual pattern in the UI that we're trying to build. Because a class like card can be used to build anything that looks like a card, not just a user profile. So I heard this, and I thought, wait a minute. I thought we kind of agreed, and that there was some consensus, at least around people that I consider to be smarter than me, that putting presentational information in your HTML was just like a faux pas, and that was the road to maintainability hell. That was the thing that made your code suck, that made it hard to tame and keep under control. But Nicholas here was saying that all that effort that I was putting in to try and make my CSS maintainable was actually the thing that was causing my CSS to be unmaintainable. And that if I wanted things to be maintainable, especially at scale, like he was working at Twitter, a huge site, that I needed to do the exact opposite of what I thought I was supposed to do.
If every instinct you have is wrong, then the opposite would have to be right.
So at this point, I decided to sort of throw out all the existing beliefs I had about how to write CSS and what I thought was important in terms of my markup and what information should go where. And I decided to sort of sacrifice all of the sort of purity of my HTML and decide to stop caring about leaking presentational information into my HTML and instead treat my CSS as this sort of holy place where I needed to protect it at all costs from knowing anything about the actual site that I wanted to build in terms of content. I wanted to start writing all my CSS like a third-party library, where it has no clue where it's going to be consumed or who's going to use it to build what. So I would take classes like this chat notification class, and I would see, okay, well, on the screen, this looks like a card. So I'm going to call this card instead. And now anytime I see other cards, well, I can use this class. But what I started to run into was that I'd find other things in the UI that were very, 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 very close to this, but maybe the difference was instead of having a shadow and instead of being constrained to a certain width, this thing that otherwise was exactly like a card was full width with no shadow. It had the same border radius, the same background color, the same padding. It was a card, it just didn't have a shadow, and it extended to the full width of the parent element. So in the spirit of making things as reusable as possible, this led me to do things like break up classes like card into multiple classes. So card MD here is responsible for setting the max width of the card, and card shadowed is responsible for saying, well, this card should have a shadow. And that way I can use the card class without that modifier if I ever just want to make a card without a shadow. But then when I was looking through the CSS for this sort of stuff, I'd noticed that like the card shadowed class only did one thing. It literally just set a box shadow. And the box shadow, wasn't specifically related to even cards at all. It was really just about elevation. There were other things in my project that definitely weren't cards that had the exact same box shadow. So again, in the spirit of sort of reusability, it became clear that, well, maybe I should just call this class shadow. And then anytime I want to give anything this shadow, I can just stick that class on there and be good to go. So you can sort of imagine like the natural conclusion of this is that stuff that looked like this started to look like this. And this probably looks familiar to most of the people in here. If you don't use Tailwind, I don't know why you're here. This is a celebration. But you probably know the rest of the story from here. At this point, I sort of realized, okay, when I'm writing my CSS this way and I need to build some piece of UI, most of the time I didn't even have to write CSS at all. I could just build the thing I wanted to build using the existing pieces that I'd made. And even more interesting was that I could start a brand new project with a different design and copy the CSS files from the last project and still not have to write any new CSS and still be able to implement fairly custom-looking designs. So that's when it became clear to me that there was potential for this to sort of get extracted into some sort of library or framework. And that became Tailwind CSS v0.1.0. And this is exactly what macOS looked like at the time that we released that. So fast forward to today, we're like almost 6 years later. This was, I think, October 31st, 2017. We're on Tailwind CSS, v3.3. It's seen so many changes and so many improvements. The framework is installed now over 25 million times per month, which makes it the most downloaded CSS framework on all of NPM, which is absolutely insane to me. The framework in total has been installed 300 million times. Over 3.3 million unique installations of our IntelliSense plugin. And this is literally unique installs, like on a separate account on our computer. If you download it again after uninstalling it, it doesn't count. So there's literally millions of human beings that are using the CSS framework. It's absolutely crazy. And it's used by over 5 million open source projects on GitHub. Sorry, Craig Federighi, I know you're the only one who's supposed to use that animation, but I'm trying it out today. Even major companies like Shopify are using Tailwind CSS now to build things like this new marketing site experience that they released a couple months ago. Netflix is using Tailwind for sites like this global top 10 page. OpenAI, all their marketing sites are built with Tailwind CSS, and even ChatGPT itself is built with Tailwind CSS. And there's a bunch of elements in ChatGPT that are actually built with Tailwind UI. So every time that ChatGPT logs you out of your session because you haven't used it in a while, and you get that little modal that pops up, that was me. All right. Mr. Beast is using Tailwind CSS for some of his brands. And what I love about this example is that the vision for Tailwind from the beginning was to create this layer of abstraction that still let you build absolutely anything. And this is not what I had in mind, and they were still able to build a crazy site like this with Tailwind. So at this point, when a new website comes out, I'm almost more surprised when it's not built with Tailwind than when it is. And that's just an absolutely crazy feeling to me. So, like I said, the framework's been around for almost 6 years now. And there's never been a single time where we've tried to get a bunch of people who like Tailwind CSS in the same room. There's never been a single local meetup, a single conference, anything. So this is the very first time ever that we've tried to gather a bunch of people from the Tailwind community into sort of one place and sort of celebrate what we've accomplished here. So I just want to say thank you so much to everyone who made it out here. Some people flew in from fucking Germany to come to this event. So thank you so much for being a part of this. Thank you so much for being part of the Tailwind community and helping us build this thing into what it is today. So with that said, we've built this tool that's this really capable tool that's used by millions of people to build some of the world's biggest websites. Where do we go from here? What are we focused on? So that's kind of what I want to spend a bunch of time talking about tonight. So one of the things that we've always invested in, that's always been really important to us, is sort of making sure that Tailwind always lets you take full advantage of all the latest and greatest, coolest stuff in CSS and the web as a platform. So we sort of always have our finger on the pulse of what's coming in CSS, what new stuff has been released, what stuff is being prototyped in different browsers, and trying to find ways that we can expose those features to you so you can build awesome stuff with it. So to walk through some of the coolest new stuff that's landed in CSS recently and how you can take advantage of it in Tailwind, I'd like to welcome rising YouTube sensation, Sam Selikoff.
Thanks, bud. All right. This is one hell of a meetup. Jeez. Who's ready for some mob programming? Sound good? What's that? Center div. No, come on, that's so 2018. We're in 2023 now. We're gonna be doing a little more than centering a div here. So yeah, I'm just gonna run through 5 quick demos here and just show off some cool stuff that you can do with Tailwind. Maybe you've seen it, maybe you haven't, and just talk about some cool stuff. That's kind of why I'm here. So to start, we have this little mock site. It's like a cool brand. It has like this little lime green flavor to the icon here. And we have this settings page. Probably looks like a lot of similar to things that a lot of you have built before. One of the things that's a bummer about these native HTML controls is this kind of default blue treatment. And we're so used to being able to customize things as web developers, and then we get to these native controls, and it's a bummer. We can't change them, right? Well, one thing that I learned that Tailwind added recently is this little class called accent. So if we find this show player controls checkbox right here, you might not know this, but we have a utility called accent, and this gets all of the colors in Tailwind. So we can find our lime, go straight to 400, and if I save this, come on, I said we're mob programming here. I'm not getting any help. Oh, I probably need to refresh. Okay, there we go. So we can just add this accent class to any one of these utilities, this utility class to any one of these controls here, rather. And look at all this cool stuff that we get. We get the focused, the active state. We get when we hold it down, and that's a little bit different on both of those states. But we don't have to do this with every single one of these, right? We can take this off, go to the root div here, and we can just add accent lime 400, just like that. And we're going to get that for all of these controls, just like that. And if we hover over this class in the HTML, we're going to see it's setting this accent color CSS property, which is something that I had never heard about before, but I saw this in a release from Tailwind. So this is, I thought it was just like a nice, easy little example how Tailwind helps me stay up to date with what's going on in CSS. At this point, I've been using it for about 5 years, and I feel like I've basically outsourced that entire job of staying up to date with when browsers are ready for things. Tailwind does such a good job educating you about when a property is ready and when it's useful, but it also gives us tools to do stuff if we want to be a little bit more bleeding edge and experimental. So let's go to this second demo here. And this is the Boca Breeze, which is another Seinfeld reference. You can tell Adam has a thing for Seinfeld. But this is a fun little internet newspaper demo here. Let's go ahead and find this page. And this has kind of a cool look to it. But I think it'd be nice if we could make this title, the heading here, kind of fill up the whole page, just like you would see in like a classic newspaper. And the way you might do this normally is just with responsive prefixes and normal text size utilities, right? So maybe when we're down small, 7x is okay. Maybe actually down here we want to start it off at 5x. And that looks all right, but maybe when we get to small screen, we go to 7XL. You probably all know this, so once we get to a certain size, the text should jump up. And maybe instead of 7, we can go to 9, something like that. But there's kind of a new technique, or a technique I had never really thought about before, which is fluid, setting the font size to be a fluid size based on the width or the height of the viewport. And Tailwind doesn't have a first-class API for this. There's no utility that's built in. But with arbitrary value syntax, which is with the square brackets, which works on any property in Tailwind, we can do anything we want here. So I could set this to be 60 pixels, and we'll get 60 pixels. But I can also set it to be 10 VW. And now it's 10% of the overall width of the viewport. And so if I start changing this, we see that it kind of shrinks and it grows. So maybe let's bump this up to 20, something like that. And that looks pretty good here. Now when we get too small, it kind of collapses. So maybe we'll go to 19, something like that. That looks pretty good. And then when we get too big, we see that it gets too big as well. So why don't we use another feature from CSS, which is the min function, and we're going to make sure it never gets bigger than, let's say, 100 pixels. See how that looks? Maybe 120, 130, something like that. And so now we can see even if our viewport gets bigger, the text stops. And so this is just another example of, the first example we saw Tailwind bringing a first-class API utility when it's kind of ready for prime time. But any CSS feature that you're excited about, that you hear about on Twitter or you read a blog post about, I love that you can experiment with it right in Tailwind without having to wait for them to add or a new release to come out to support that feature. So that was a fun little demo, I thought. And let's go back and go to our third demo. And this is a problem a lot of you have probably run into before. This is kind of a hero treatment, something you maybe see on the homepage of a product or a website. And this H1 here usually receives a lot of deliberate intention about how it's laid out and making sure that the words wrap a certain way. And we can see here when you start with this, maybe this was the intention, for this design, but as we kind of change the size, it's not as a pleasing distribution, right, when we have some orphan words here at the end. And so one way I've solved this in the past is to say, well, we like the way this looks when it breaks right after new. So let's make this small again, come find new, and maybe we can just use a good old break tag right here, just like that, right? That works. And we can see as we get bigger, it kind of works. Seems like it works great, actually. But if we go too small, we have these really strange situations, right? Because now it's not a nice, even space. The break doesn't work. So then you start doing all sorts of stuff. Maybe you add a class name here, you make it hidden, and then you have it show on small. This is kind of a mess. Wouldn't it be cool if there was a CSS feature that took care of this for us? And it turns out there is. So let's go ahead and get rid of this break. And I'm going to come right here to H2, and I'm going to type in balance. And I'm going to see this text balance utility. And just like that, we've got 3 lines. Now we've got 2, and that's it. It's done. Check this out. This is a new utility coming to the next version of Tailwind. It uses a text wrap balance CSS feature, which has some support and more is coming. The really cool thing about this property is that it supports progressive enhancement, right? Because if you're using a browser that doesn't support it, you'll kind of just fall back to what it was doing without the class. So I don't know if you've ever worked on this before, but this is so cool, right? Just to see this again, we have this kind of dangling, orphaned word right there. Throw that on, and it just figures out it can wrap all 3. Pretty cool, right? So I thought that was a fun one to show off as well. Man, Adam even installed Vim extension on here for me. This is so cool. What a pal. All right, demo 4. This is another cool one, and this is another new feature coming to CSS, which Tailwind is going to have support for. We have this little selector right here, just kind of a simple radio group with native input type radios right here. And we can see we're doing some custom work to kind of get this active style treatment. We have like a border, we have a ring, and we have a background color here. Now, the CEO came and said, we want these to kind of pop a little bit more, right? So we want the active class to actually be a little bit more apparent. And if we look in the HTML right here, we're hovering and setting the background to Zinc 100. This is kind of the overall label element. So if we were to set this to like Indigo 600, then maybe this is more of like what we want the active state to look like. But obviously, we only want to set this class if the input is checked, right? Well, if I undo that, that had some old history in it. If I get rid of this class, it'd be really nice if I could do something like checked, background, indigo, 600, right? But it's not the label that's checked, it's the input. And we've never really had a way to style a parent element in an HTML tree based on the state of a child, right? The group utility in Tailwind lets us do the opposite. We can put a group on a parent and then style a child based on if the group is hovered, something like that, right? So we've been able to go that direction, but we haven't been able to go the other direction. If you used jQuery back in the day, they actually had this has property that let you do this, and it was really cool. Well, CSS is adding this feature as well, and Tailwind has support for it via this has-utility. And the square brackets, we saw this from before, it lets us put anything we want to here. And has is saying, if I have a child that meets this condition, it's a relational selector, and if it meets this condition in the brackets, then apply this class. And we know that inputs get a checked condition if they're checked, right? Radio elements. So now if we say has checked, let's set the background to indigo 600. I'm going to remove this old class right here. Check that out. Normally at this point, to actually pull off a design like this, I'd be reaching for like React State or something, pulling that in, and then figuring out which of these options as I'm mapping over them are checked, and then conditionally adding classes. But we don't have to do that. Just like we don't have to do it down here, we can style the input with the check pseudo class, and now we can style this label with this has, this new has relational selector, which we can see right here, just creates this CSS rule. This is the new CSS feature that we can use just like this. But our text is a little off right here. This is a little too garish, and I think we can make it look a little bit better. This is the label right here, public access. And again, it would be nice if we could do something similar, right? Has, checked, and let's make this white. But this div doesn't contain anything that's checked. This is actually outside of the tree that contains input. It's in a sibling tree. Well, the label is the lowest common ancestor of both of those siblings, right? So just like we used to do with group for the other case that we talked about, if we put a group on the lowest common ancestor of both of these things that need it, and then we use group has, just like this, now we can apply that. So this is like a really cool kind of compositional point where we get to use these new features, but the arbitrary syntax lets us do things that normally we would have to do a lot more work to do. We can keep it all in CSS. It's all going to work on the server, on the client, no matter which technology you're using. And we can do the same thing right down here to soften up this text. Let's say group has checked. And we're going to make this text indigo 200. So now that's looking a lot better. So pretty cool. I was pretty impressed when I first saw this. Again, I learned about this through Tailwind. I didn't know that this was an up-and-coming feature, but I think a lot of people are going to be using has in CSS and in Tailwind once it's fully stable. So pretty cool stuff. All right, last demo here. We're going to be talking about container queries. Who has actually used container queries in production yet? Who's played with them at all? Play with container queries in CSS. Oh man, container queries, they're so cool. Okay, so we all know we have responsive media queries, right? We can say, add this class when the screen gets to a certain size. So right now we have this single column grid, right? And once we get to a certain size, we turn it into a 2-column grid. That's through responsive media queries, which we use through the responsive utilities in Tailwind. So if we come down here, we can see at the small class, at the small screen size, which is 640 pixels, we switch our grid to a 2-column grid. And let's say that we're working on this design, it looks pretty cool, but we want to make the first testimonial kind of pop a little bit more. We want it to stand out. We want to give it kind of a featured treatment. Okay, well, one way we could do that is to make this take up 2 columns on the bigger screen. We want to keep it single on the bottom screen here, on the smallest column, smallest screen size when it's in a single column, but once we get to 2 columns, let's make it stand out. So we might come here to this div, and you might say, well, we could say if we grab the index from this loop. Maybe we'll add a class name that says, if we're the first element in the loop, let's apply a call span to. But we actually don't even need the index for that. We can just call span to. Let's just see it work first. So if I do refresh. Where's my mob? Let's see. Oh, let me make sure I'm on the right thing. Page, yeah. Container query, yeah. That doesn't look right. Let me go back here. Whoa. I think I did something. Let me grab the beginning here. This is a good trick for live coding demos, actually. Let's see if this works. Whoa. What on earth? Oh, this thing is freaking out. Look at this. All right, you know what? I actually just remembered I was going to switch to Firefox anyway, so let's just get rid of Chrome and let's try this again. You forgot everything that just happened. All right, here we go. Firefox. There we go. All right, I like the encouragement. Thank you. Appreciate you, mob. All right, this thing's not freaking out. Oh, boy. Something's going on here. How do you bring up the terminal? Restart the build. How do you bring up the terminal? I know how to bring up my terminal, but it's Adam's computer. Control J. Fast refresh. Whoa. That's an odd one to land on. Let's see. Okay. I think we're good. Look at that. Look at that. Perfect. Okay, so we're going to try this again. That was fun. I had fun. Let's get rid of that. Okay. I never use Firefox, but I can hide toolbars like that. There we go. Cool animation. Okay. So, single column, we want it like this. On 2 columns, we want to give the first testimonial a nice treatment. And so one way, let's just make sure this works again, and let's try to not break the actual process here. Call span to. This should work. Okay, I'm not crazy. I was worried there for a little bit. So, thank you. So this gives every testimonial spans both columns in the grid, right? And if we only wanted it for the first one, maybe we would do something like grab the index here, and then say if I is 0, we apply it, right? But you can actually do it even easier with just the first prefix in Tailwind. Check that out. Pretty cool, right? And if I hover over this, you'll see this uses the first child pseudo selector. So that's pretty neat. Can even do something like odd and get every odd one, which is kind of funny. But this is an easy way to go ahead and give the first testimonial more space. Now, we actually want to change the treatment because it looks a little bad when it takes up that much space. The text is a little small. It needs a little bit more breathing room. We need to make it pop a little bit more. And so at this point, normally I would solve this problem by doing something like exposing a featured prop, right? So we would say featured, and then maybe we would grab the index again and say, okay, this is featured if we're the first in the array. And then we could go into testimonial and use the new prop to give it the new treatment. But with container queries, we don't have to do this, right? This is what is really cool about container queries. So let me show you how this works. We're going to go into testimonial. I'm going to add a class to the root right here, and I'm going to mark this as container. And now we can specify new adjustments based on the size that the element takes up. Just like responsive utilities let us adjust our UI based on the size of the screen, container queries let us adjust the UI based on the size that the actual element takes up. So for example, if I come to this block quote where we render the body of the testimonial, I can say at LG, this is a container query, and we see it says min width is 32 rem. Let's go ahead and bump up the text size to text XL. And so what's happening here is this card is taking up more than 32 rems, so it's getting that new treatment. But once we make it small, then we have another bug in our UI. Because we only want this to happen when we're on small screens. So when we go back to the first column, the first testimonial takes up the same amount of space as every other testimonial, so it gets the same treatment. But once we go to 2 columns, the first testimonial takes up enough space for that container query to take effect. Pretty cool, right? We didn't change anything about this testimonial invocation. The caller didn't have to know anything about how to call it to turn it into a featured card. It just had to render it into a space that was large enough. So let's go and keep going here. Text large, let's make it font semi-bold. And at large, let's make the tracking a little bit tighter. And we'll come up to here to P6, where we have our padding. And let's just say when we're large, let's go ahead and make P10, padding 10. It's looking better. We've got 6 units of spacing here, so maybe space Y8 for large. And yeah, that's starting to look pretty nice. And again, if we come down to where we're rendering this, if I go back to odd instead of just first, it's kind of a funny result, but look at, you get the idea. We've made the testimonial render the appropriate version of itself based on the space. And so the caller doesn't know, caller doesn't care. However this card is rendered, whether we're on a small screen or a big screen, it doesn't matter the overall screen size. What matters is how much space the container has. So pretty awesome feature. Let's do one more thing, actually. I'm going to come and just grab this image. And we'll come back up here. And these all have an image for the actual company where the author works. So we can drop an image right there, which I think looks good on this featured one, but these, it doesn't have enough space. So let's actually start this out as hidden. And then if we're in a large enough container, we'll go ahead and bring it back to block. So pretty cool. I think container queries, once how to use them becomes more common knowledge, I think they're going to replace a lot of the work we did with media queries, just because of all this stuff that you're seeing here. Again, we always get the right treatment based on the size. I think it's particularly useful if you don't know how your component's going to be rendered. So you can imagine something like a newsletter sign up that you want people on your team to be able to put in anywhere, right? Maybe they put it on the footer where they have a full width of the screen and they want to have more information there. Maybe you put it, but when the full page is shrunk down, you want a small version, right? But maybe you also want that newsletter sign up to be in a sidebar somewhere. So you could be on a large screen, but still want to be able to use your newsletter sign up in a small area. That's a perfect use case for container queries because you can make the newsletter component adapt to how much space it needs, and the caller doesn't have to know about it up front. So pretty awesome little technique coming to CSS and already available with the official container queries plugin from Tailwind. So that's how we're doing this today. And just one more cool little thing I want to show you. If we zoom out here and go back to just making the first column, the featured one, we'll see at this XL breakpoint, whoops, so close. We'll see at this XL breakpoint, I'll actually just zoom out so we can see the code. We kind of get this 4-column grid. We can see that right here. XL, when we have 1280 pixels, we get 4 columns. And now our treatment looks a little bit funny. So let's actually move it over with first and XL. We're actually going to start this column at 2. So that's a nice little trick we can use with call start 2 to start it at the second column of the grid. And this looks pretty cool. It's not bad, but you can see there's kind of some awkward spaces in this layout, and it would be really cool if we could get rid of them. Well, there's another really awesome feature coming to CSS, and let me show you how it works. I'm going to come right here, and I'm going to say grid rows. We're going to see these are the grid row utilities that are included in Tailwind. They set the grid template rows property, but again, just like anything in Tailwind, we can set our own using the arbitrary syntax, arbitrary value syntax, and check this out. Masonry, I think I misspelled it. Masonry, grid rows. There we go. All right, let's try that again. So just so you can see what happened, delete that. we've got these spaces. I'm going to put this to masonry. And this is another new feature coming to CSS. If you've ever tried to build this before, especially in a way that is robust to a responsive layout like this, you know it is much, much harder than adding a single class. And now we have this really cool layout, and all of the space in between is even though we have different height cards in the columns. So those are some really cool things that you can do with modern Tailwind. I love all the stuff I've learned about CSS since using Tailwind, and I also love that you can experiment with it using this arbitrary syntax. So that's what I wanted to show you today. Thanks a lot, and here's Adam.
Awesome job, man.
Am I good?
I think my mic's on. Yeah.
Do you have it memorized? Yeah, that was great. Thanks, Sam. I really appreciate you walking through some of that stuff. I'm really excited about a lot of those features. So next, I guess I want to talk about some of the stuff that we're doing with Tailwind, the tool. Sam talked a lot about some of the developer experience stuff we're working on in terms of exposing some of these new CSS features and stuff to you. Well, there's sort of two sides to Tailwind as a framework. There's what we let you build, and then there's what it's like to configure and work with and set up and use it as part of your tool chain. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the improvements that we're working on there. So before I get into any of this stuff, because it's interesting and some of it is a little bit different, I do want to talk about like a value that we really have in terms of maintaining Tailwind, and something that we really care about and we think about a lot with every change that we make to the tool, is that backwards compatibility and stability is super, super, super important to us. I don't think anybody wants to waste time upgrading and migrating things to a new version of something when everything was working totally fine before. So I've got some new things that I want to show here, but all the stuff that we're talking about here, these aren't like Tailwind CSS v4.0 paradigm shifting things. This is like Tailwind CSS v3.4. Use it in the next version if you want type of stuff. So let's get into it. Let's see if this is working. Cool. So Tailwind, the Black Album. No. So we've been working on an internal project that we're calling Tailwind CSS Oxide, which is sort of our vision for sort of the next evolution of Tailwind CSS as sort of an engine for generating your CSS. And I want to talk about some of the improvements that we're trying to make there, and then walk you through a demo of how some of it works, so you can sort of see what it looks like to apply this stuff in a real project. So the first thing that we've been working on is unifying the tool chain, whatever the fuck that means. So I think if you've worked with Tailwind for any amount of time, you've probably noticed that Tailwind isn't usually the only thing that you install to process your CSS on a project that you're using Tailwind. Even in our own documentation, we tell you to install PostCSS, install auto prefixer. If you want to handle like build time imports, you got to install PostCSS import. If you want to transpile modern CSS syntax features, you have to install something like PostCSS preset env. And I think that made a lot of sense in the early days of Tailwind, when I think asking people to go all in on a tool like this when it was still really new felt like a big ask. But now, like we sort of talked about, I showed you some of the things that people are building with this and some of the teams that are adopting Tailwind. I think there's a big chunk of people out there who just want to install Tailwind and not think about anything else, and that does all your CSS stuff for you, and you just don't think about anything. So that's one of the things that we've been working on. So the Oxide engine that we've been working on has built-in support for @imports. So anytime that you have some CSS stuff that you want to reorganize and move into a different file, you don't have to install PostCSS import anymore. You just do it, and it just works. Same with vendor prefixing. So in the past, we've always asked you to install auto prefixer, add it to your PostCSS config file. Otherwise, you might be missing necessary vendor prefixes for browsers that you need to support. Going forward, while we're still probably going to make it possible for you to disable that if you want, by default, we're just going to handle that for you, so you don't have to think about it. Syntax transforms. So I kind of briefly mentioned PostCSS preset env. There's a lot of sort of modern CSS features that can be sort of down transpiled into a syntax that current CSS supports. So I think the classic one that will resonate with everyone is like CSS nesting. So we've had support for compiling nesting through like Sass and Less and stuff like that forever. And you can also do that with PostCSS, with PostCSS nested, or I think it's built into PostCSS preset env as well. And we have the Tailwind CSS nesting plugin that makes it a little easier to do it with Tailwind in a way that's compatible with some of Tailwind's other features. CSS nesting is actually landed officially in several browsers already, but not everyone can use it as is in the browser. Because people need to support like Safari 15 still, which is still pretty popular. But that's the sort of thing that we can just do for you. So instead of having to install a plugin, if you want to use nesting in your custom CSS, just use nesting. We'll just transpile it for you. Another one that people are getting excited about lately is like modern wide gamut color space stuff. So has anyone heard of like lab or LCH color spaces? Yeah, a couple people, yeah. They're like really crazy bright colors that only like really great displays can show. Like all your phones can probably render them, but most desktop monitors can't. Those are only supported in fairly recent browsers, which means most of the time you just don't get to use them because you don't want people to see nothing on browsers that don't support those color formats. But there's some math that you can do to sort of figure out the nearest RGB color that is supported by older browsers and fall back to that. So that's an example of something that we're also just going to handle for you going forward. So you can just use modern color space stuff, and anyone whose device doesn't support it will just see like the nearest fallback color. No configuration required, Tailwind will just do this. So how does this all work under the hood? All these things are powered by this new tool called Lightning CSS, which is developed by Devin Gubbett and the Parcel team, which is this really modern Rust-based CSS transformation platform that's just incredible. You know, in the past, we would have recommended use auto prefixer if you need to add vendor prefixes. Now we can say use Lightning CSS if you want to add vendor prefixes because it does the same thing and it does it faster. Or you want to add import support, install PostCSS import. Now we can just say use Lightning CSS. Lightning CSS is actually the answer for basically every single feature that you might install a plugin to handle with PostCSS. So rather than just trying to tell people to integrate this themselves, we just decided, let's just integrate it and take advantage of all the benefits that we get from that and the better developer experience. And again, I'm going to walk through a demo that shows how this stuff actually works. Okay, so the next thing that I want to talk about before we get to the demo is improved performance. So Lightning CSS, like I mentioned, is a native library written in Rust, which means it gets to take advantage of like multi-threading and parallelization, which you can't easily do in Node, which gives you a lot of opportunity to make things faster than you could ever make them in Node. So by leveraging Lightning CSS for vendor prefixing and for minification, for example, we get a lot of performance improvements in Tailwind just out of the box for free. Sort of following the lead of tools like Lightning CSS and a lot of other developer tools that have been looking for ways to optimize performance by taking advantage of writing certain parts of their code in native languages and sort of compiling it down to native code. We have actually been rewriting some core pieces of Tailwind in Rust to take advantage of this sort of thing. So one of those things is the parsing layer of Tailwind that looks at all of your HTML files or React files or whatever and finds all those little classes and pulls them out so Tailwind can generate all of the CSS. This is like a perfectly parallelizable task because it's basically just like a pure function that takes some input and spits out an array of class names. So we can split that up across all the cores on your computer and do it way faster than we ever could with Node. Here's like an example of like the performance improvement. So in Tailwind CSS 3.3, I have like a pretty realistic example project that I'm going to use for this demo. When I measure the performance of doing a production build and with minification and stuff like that on Tailwind 3.3, we're getting compile times of about 330 milliseconds. Using the new Oxide engine, doing all the exact same stuff, the whole thing compiles in like 130 milliseconds. So it's like over twice as fast, which is pretty exciting. And there's still a lot of low-hanging fruit left. Like we're still doing a lot of stuff that we could lean on Lightning CSS for more that we're looking to keep exploring. So I'll show you this stuff, but it's pretty exciting and it's pretty cool and it's pretty fun and it's a good excuse to learn a new language, which is always fun too, selfishly. So the third piece of this sort of Oxide engine is simplified configuration, which on the surface doesn't sound that exciting maybe. Simplified configuration, sure. But here's an example of something that people run into all the time that we hear about in our Discord and GitHub issues basically every day. Someone's created a new file, they're adding some classes to this new component that they made, they open it up in the browser, and some things just aren't there. The border radius is wrong, even though the class is right there in the component. What's going on? Like, why is this not working? And inevitably, the answer is always that they forgot to go into their Tailwind config file, update their content array to include like this new folder where they've added this component or whatever, and when they do that and restart the build, everything works. But it's just like an annoying little paper cut that makes the experience worse for everybody. So something we've been working on is what we've been calling automatic content detection. So by taking advantage of the fact that we've rewritten a bunch of core pieces of Tailwind in Rust, we can do more work than we were doing before and still do it faster than the less amount of work that we were doing in the previous engine. So by using some heuristics and algorithms that we came up with for trying to make really educated guesses about where the files are going to be in your project based on what files you have already and where they're located and what extensions you're using and stuff, we've actually put together like a what feels like very bulletproof, feature that lets you just not configure content at all. That whole content thing in your Tailwind config disappears, and Tailwind just knows where everything is, and it just works, and it works perfectly. And I have a couple other configuration things that I want to talk about, but I'm going to save those for the demo. So why don't we look at some actual code? Back in my comfort zone, So what do we got here? Okay, so I've got like this demo project here. And you can see it's got like this big components folder with lots of sort of components that you'd expect to see in your classic front-end heavy sort of application. In the config file, let me know if this is clear enough. By the way, is this font size big enough? Yeah, it's okay. So we're installing post-CSS import. We've got Tailwind CSS nesting installed. Then, of course, Tailwind and auto prefixer. In our app.css file, I'm importing all Tailwind's little layers. I'm importing some custom fonts into the base layer, and those are over on this file. So this is why I care about the post-CSS import stuff. I've got some custom typography styles, and in the typography styles, there's like some nesting and stuff like that. So I want to process this nesting too. So that's why I've got all this stuff sort of installed. So let's just like run the build. Run build latest, I think it was. So that's kind of like the performance times that I was telling you, right? So like 338 milliseconds, 341 milliseconds, 353 milliseconds. Just gets slower and slower and slower the longer you go. So let's just switch this over to the Oxide engine. I'm just going to do npm run build Oxide, which is going to run sort of our experimental insider version of Tailwind. Just doing the exact same thing. 136 milliseconds, 136 milliseconds, 136 milliseconds. You might think there's a console log in a code base even that says console log done in 136 milliseconds, but I assure you that's not the case. There we go. See? It's just very, very stable, okay? So now that we've switched over to this Oxide engine, let me show you what we can do in terms of simplifying the configuration and have everything still work. So first, let's start in like the post-CSS config, right? So I'm going to open, I've got like this output CSS file here. Whoa. So we can sort of, come on. I guess I need to open the main one too, whatever. Out. Why is this not showing me all the tabs? I think I might have changed tab visibility, so you command shift D. Oh, you animal. All right, okay, we'll get there. We'll get everything in the right place. Okay, app.css, out.css. Okay, so we can look at sort of inputs and outputs here. This is minified, so I'll compile like the unminified one. So we'll do npm run. I've got like a dev script that does the same thing, but without minification. 136 milliseconds. Who would have guessed? So let's just take a look here, like for like typography class. You can see that it's processing the nesting. So all those like ampersand symbols are gone. So let's just go to the post-CSS config and just get rid of the post-CSS import and run it again. Oh, it got slower. Oh, still, all of that stuff, the import is handled because the typography was in a separate file. Nesting is still handled, sure. Let's delete the nesting. Oh, nesting is all still there, so we didn't need that. Let's look for like some WebKit prefixes or something. I think like WebKit appearance is sort of the classic one. Let's get rid of auto prefixer. Do we need that? Nope, all vendor prefixes are still being added. So now what took like configuring 4 plugins, putting them in the right order, making sure everything was wired up correctly, you just don't have to think about it with what we're working on now. You just install the newest version of Tailwind, it just does all that stuff. It's pretty cool. And we're hoping to find ways to even make this like post-CSS config unnecessary. And I don't have any official news on that yet, but we're collaborating with maintainers of popular build tools and frameworks to see what we can do to just get Tailwind detected. Kind of like Sass or less, where if the project knows you're using Tailwind and you have it installed, it just runs it for you. Because this ends up being like the only really remaining piece of post-CSS configuration. Okay, so next thing is like the content config, right? So we've got the path to all of our content here. Normally, if I was gonna like delete that, and then if I run like the other old build of Tailwind, it's gonna complain at me. Now it's gonna be like, no utility classes were detected in your source files, you jackass. Make sure that you add the content option. But the newest version of Tailwind that we're working on merely just warns you that this feature is experimental and may change, but it does work, and all the CSS is generated. So that's pretty cool. So on top of that, I mentioned like the modern color space stuff. You can see in the config here that I've got these OKLCH colors for these like really neon colors. If we go over here and take a look at the compiled CSS, we'll do the unminified one so we can read that more easily. You can see that it's like compiled it down to lab instead of OKLCH because lab has better browser support, I guess, than OKLCH, but can represent all the exact same stuff. And it's also found like the nearest hex code that'll work in any browser and added that as a fallback. So if the browser sees this declaration and can't parse it, it'll fall back to this one, and everyone will just get something pretty close. And I didn't have to do any configuration for this. This is just something that Tailwind's gonna do for you now, thanks to all the awesome work that the Parcel team has done on Lightning CSS. So that's pretty exciting. So a couple other things that I wanna show you. So one is like a really minor paper cut thing, but I'm like unreasonably excited about it. So I'm gonna share it anyways, and maybe you'll be excited about it too. You're probably used to doing like @Tailwind base, you know, putting all that stuff in all your files, or if you're using imports in the past, you'd have to switch to our import syntax because of a bunch of weird rules about how post-CSS import cares about the order of things. In Oxide, we've set things up so that you simply just import Tailwind CSS, and that's it. And you're good. And even doing that, all of the layers stuff still works because this just kind of inlines the exact same thing that you would have typed by hand. In hindsight, super obvious thing. There should have been Tailwind for a long time. But I really just love like how it feels. It just kind of feels like I'm pulling up my CSS file, I've installed Tailwind, import Tailwind CSS, Tailwind's in my project. That like feels like the right experience. So that's pretty exciting to me, unreasonably exciting. The last thing I want to show you, and this is something I didn't talk about when I was just going through the slides, because this is the one where I'm curious to see what people actually think about it, because I think it's kind of cool, but you know, we'll see what everybody thinks. You'll notice that in like our config file, now that we don't have like the content stuff, the only thing that's left in here is this like design token configuration stuff. I look at this and I kind of see it as like, this is like a CSS value, but because I'm in JavaScript, I have to wrap it in a string. That's kind of weird. Or what, this list of fonts is in an array, and if I don't want to put it in an array because you often have to quote fonts, I have to use like different types of quotes to make sure that I can still have quotes in there and stuff. It's always kind of felt like this clunky, not native thing. And I have this like vision in my head of trying to make Tailwind feel like a more holistic, native, sort of platform-ish tool, even though, of course, it's always going to be a build tool that has to do all sorts of crazy stuff. So let me show you like an idea that I have that we've prototyped that, I don't know, I think it's kind of neat. I'm going to copy these colors and go over to the CSS file, and I'm going to create a new selector called theme, which is kind of like the root selector in CSS, but it's targeting what we're calling like your theme. I'm going to paste in this stuff. We'll do a little bit of cleanup here. Get rid of these quotes, add our semicolons so it looks like CSS. And we're going to turn these into just vanilla CSS variable declarations. So we're just declaring a color called neon pink, a color called neon lime, a color called neon cyan. Let's run the build again, the dev one, so we can actually read it. And of course, like we haven't changed the config, right? So you'd expect these colors to still be there. But if I go back to the config, I can delete the colors, run it again. Oh, what do you know? The colors are still there. That's kind of cool. And we can do the same thing with the fonts. So let's paste these in, font, family, and get rid of the array. Just make it feel like CSS, you know? It even like, it's, you know, prettier, understands it. It formats it when I save, because it just looks like CSS. Go back and delete this stuff from the config. Run the build. What did we call those fonts? Like Satoshi. So, you know, there's our display font. It's there. It's working. And then you look at this config file, and it's like, huh, that's weird. Why the fuck does this file exist? And then you delete the file, and then you run the build, and everything still works. And now the only place that you're even thinking about Tailwind is in a CSS file instead of in a JavaScript configuration file. So there's still some like weird stuff to figure out here, and there's like a lot of complex things that I've been wrestling with, how the hell I can represent them in CSS. Like one of the weird things is like if I want to override all the colors, the best I've been able to come up with so far is like colors unset. And in theory, I think this is, that doesn't work. So that's just an idea. But those are the sorts of things that I'm still trying to like figure out how we can support all the things that Tailwind currently supports with the JavaScript configuration. But like I look at this file and it just kind of feels like, oh, this speaks to me in this hard to explain way. So this is a path that I'm really interested in exploring. And I think what excites me about it the most is that something that we hear about a lot from Tailwind users is they almost feel like dirty writing CSS sometimes, even though there's a lot of good reasons to write custom CSS in your projects. People are always looking for ways to do it in their config file or something instead to keep everything in JavaScript. And I feel like if we can push a lot of the configuration to CSS, people won't be looking for like, how do I add my custom font face stuff to my config file? Shouldn't that be in the config file? Well, no, just put it in your CSS. Don't add this weird, unnecessary layer in between everything. So I think if we can nail this from an API perspective, that it's going to make people a lot more comfortable just using CSS for the stuff that you can just use CSS for, like keyframes and font face and all that sort of stuff. So very early, very sort of experimental, but yeah, I'm excited about that. So hope you guys think that's kind of cool too. So there's one other thing that I want to talk about. And one of the things that like we've always cared about a lot with Tailwind, and sort of like the goal of the whole project has been to help you build custom designs, you know? That's like where we've sort of put our flag down. Like, sure, it's nice if you can just help people move faster, but if it's ever at the expense of people being able to build totally custom stuff, I'm not really interested in working on this project anymore. To me, Tailwind was meant to be an alternative to opening up a vanilla CSS file and doing everything from scratch. It needs to have all that flexibility for it to still be something that I really believe in. At the same time, I really want to find ways to give people like higher jumping off points when they're building stuff so they can move a little bit faster. And that's something that we aimed to solve with products like Tailwind UI, where if you want to grab like a pricing section for your website, you can find something that's pretty close to what you want, grab the HTML, paste it into your project, tweak it however you want, and you're moving a lot faster. we've got a new thing that we're working on that's sort of in that same vein that's taken a little while to really figure out how to get right. And it's still very, very, very early. But because this is the first time we've ever got anyone together in the same room to talk about Tailwind stuff, I thought, I better show off some of the exciting early stuff before it's ready and give everyone a sneak peek and make it a little more special. So we're working on this thing that we're calling Catalyst, which is our very first sort of fully componentized React application UI kit. I'm going to show you an example of a demo project that we've been working on that is built with Catalyst, so I can sort of explain a little bit more about what it is, and then show you some code too. So this is sort of a demo kind of SaaS dashboard application for like a ticket tool. Think of it kind of like an Eventbrite alternative or something. And this is built with a bunch of pre-designed, pre-implemented components that are part of this package that we're calling Catalyst. So the sidebar layout comes from Catalyst. This date picker, the thing that everybody has wanted us to build forever, comes from Catalyst. These drop-downs, part of Catalyst. Table, drop-downs over here. You can click into orders. There's like a dialogue. There's all the kind of form elements that you'd ever be looking for in any of the projects that you build. Just all the sort of building blocks that you need to build like an application UI. We're trying to design them and build them with React and put them together in a way that you can get these into your project and move really, really fast. Now, I think a lot of people might be looking at this and thinking like, well, this kind of looks a lot like what you get with Tailwind UI already with sort of like the application UI kit. I can copy and paste different things. And that's mostly true, but what we've tried to do here is double down on sort of like a different part of the trade-off curve. And the best way to sort of demonstrate that, I think, is to jump into sort of some code and show you kind of what we imagine the developer experience to be like. So remember, this is just an early preview, and there's a lot more that we want to do, but I'm excited to still show you kind of where we are at with this so far. So first things first, I've got this empty Next.js app that I've created. And I think it's important to mention that what we're building here, although it is a React sort of component kit, it's not Next.js specific. You can use this with Remix, you can use it with a Vite-based React app, or you can use it with an Inertia app, for example. And all I've done here is just created a new app, installed Tailwind, and installed a couple of libraries that we're using as part of Catalyst. So I've installed React Aria components, which is another great project that's built by the same people who work on Parcel, Devin at Adobe, which is a really great accessible sort of headless UI library that's really battle tested with tons and tons of components. I've got Framer Motion for animations and stuff. I've got Heroicons, which is our own icon library. And I've got CLSX, which is just a great little utility for conditionally adding classes to elements. Everything else is just like stock vanilla stuff that comes with Next.js. So imagine you've downloaded Catalyst, whatever that means, right? So let's go back a folder here. You've downloaded Catalyst v0.0.0.0.0.0.1. Unzipped it. I pull it open, there's a components folder. I can just copy this components folder into my app. Ooh, that was loud. And now, the mental model here is you've just basically scaffolded all of the sort of boilerplate and generic pieces, building blocks that you need to build these sorts of applications. So what it's not is it's not a library that you install from NPM and consume like Material UI or something like that. Those libraries are awesome for the right use case, but it doesn't really align with my vision for what I want to help people do with Tailwind, which is build custom stuff. And I think if you're constrained to whatever APIs and configuration options and stuff that are exposed by the sorts of libraries that you're using, it never really feels like your own code. And I always want to make sure that the things people are building with Tailwind feel like their own code. So I'm just going to pull open like a little page example that I've got here and restart the server because God knows what port it's running on. 3000, the default. So we've got this beautiful white screen here. Let me, yeah, we'll just kind of, I'll do a split screen thing, I think. See if we can make that work. So where was that? Here? All right. So again, really early, but I'm going to show you a couple of little pieces. So say we wanted to build like a little create account form or something. We give you building blocks like page heading, you know? And we could say like, create your account. And now we've got a page heading here with some thoughtfully chosen typographic styles and a thoughtfully chosen font size and line height and all that sort of thing. Now say we wanted to create like the fields. You know, I can pull in like text field. We'll have to like import that from our components. These are all coming from this components folder that we just dumped in. And say that's like, got a label of email. You know? Okay, maybe let's add some space between these elements. So we'll add like a class name of space y8 or whatever. Maybe we want to add another field, like for your password. And maybe we'll make this a type email. You know, all these props just kind of proxy through down to the root input that we're rendering. Say we want to add like some descriptive text or something. You know, we can add a description like must be at least 12 characters. You know, so the thing I think is interesting is like, while it doesn't look like much on the surface, the opportunity that this creates for us to think through kind of like thoughtfully designed APIs that match the sort of thing that you'd be building in your app if you're building your own UI kit is really interesting, and it's not something that we've had the opportunity to really do before with the sort of delivery mechanism that we use for Tailwind UI, where it's just copy and paste the snippet, do whatever you want with it. I think that's really powerful, and I'm glad we have a product that fills that need, but a lot of people want something that's more batteries included, where different components have different relationships with each other and stuff like that. A good example of that, like something that we can't just do when the delivery mechanism is just static HTML, is like validation errors, you know? So say you submitted this form and an error came back from the server and you kind of grabbed it out of the response and you just populated this with like, this is the worst password I've ever seen in my life, you know? Okay, that's just gonna automatically render it red. We've got like a red validation state now. And if we get rid of that, everything kind of goes back to how it was. Cool, right? And then like you've got like the stuff that everybody needs all the time, like your classic like button component, you know? So create account. And you can, of course, mix and match all this stuff with all the sort of compositional tools you use in Tailwind already. So like, I want this to be on the right, so I'm gonna use text right to move it off to the right. It's not meant to be like this abstraction layer where you never think about Tailwind. In fact, if you want to customize these components, and that's sort of one of the main reasons that you'd use this thing, you'd open up the components directory, you'd find something like that text field component, and remember, this like isn't in node modules or anything, right? Like this is, you've scaffolded this into your app, it's your code. So one of the challenges for us, because of that, and it's something that has proved to be an interesting challenge and something we're continuing to work hard on, is making sure that the code that we give you feels like code that you would write in your own project. It doesn't feel like really clever, obfuscated library code or anything like that. So we're using TypeScript currently on this stuff, because I know everyone's begging us for TypeScript support for things. And I'm pretty sure we're going to be able to find a way to distribute it with TypeScript and without TypeScript for people who just want to stick with vanilla JavaScript. But yeah, say I wanted to like tweak the padding or the gap between the description and the label. I can just come in here and change it. And you're not editing code that's going to get overridden next time you run npm install. Like, this is your code. We just generated a starting point for you that is like thoughtfully designed and lets you sort of hit the ground running. So there's a lot more to this, of course, than like just these sort of simple basic components that I'm showing you here. But I thought kind of focusing on these was a good way to sort of try and set up the mental model for what we want the developer experience to be like. You get the package, you dump it into your project, it's yours, you can do whatever you want with it, but it's built, hopefully, you know, our hope is that we're building it in the exact same way that you would build it yourself, so that once you've been using it for a while and building your app with it and customizing it and tweaking things, like 6 months into the project, you almost forget that you used our thing as a starting point, that it's just your code. And I think that's the only way that we can build something like this that lives up to sort of that sort of value that I have for the framework, where a team like Shopify could use this to build a product and not feel like they were relying on a third-party thing. They just feel like they got to like skip the first 6 levels of the game, you know? So to talk more about some of like the design details that have gone into this and dig deeper into a lot of these things that we're designing and including here, I'm gonna bring out my business partner, who is a former YouTube sensation, but I think he wants to get back into the game, Steve Shoger.
Cool. How's it going, everybody? Having a good day? So Adam just gave you a sneak peek of this. This is the application UI kit we've been working on. And this is sort of the main dashboard screen, and it sort of captures the general look and feel we're going for this thing. So what I want to do is kind of get into some of the design details, some of the design thinking, and sort of take you on the journey of how we got to this page. So just before I get into that, I want to talk about a few of the goals. Like, we really wanted something a look that was very flexible. Like, you could put any logo up in that top corner, it would still work for your brand. But we didn't want it too generic either. We wanted something that had a little bit more personality to it. And this is really tricky at first. Like, here's some of our earlier concepts that we were exploring. So, we tried incorporating color into it. You can see how we have this little gradient style selected option in the sidebar here. Here's a great way to sort of, like, one thing I like to do when I design application UIs is sort of incorporate a visual gimmick into it. So, because internal app screens, they always tend to have, they're just tables and forms, and it's just a lot of boring text, right? There's not a lot of opportunities like you would get on like a marketing site to incorporate that like marketing flair, that visual flair into it. And this is like, what you kind of say here up at the top is this like a nice way to kind of bring your brand's visual identity into your internal screen. So here we kind of have this these warped circles grazing the top of the page here. So like Stripe, for example, I got a screenshot of Stripe here. They kind of do that. These colored stripes is a really important part of their visual identity, and they kind of brought it into some of their select dashboard screens. So it's a nice little way to bring that visual flair into the app screens. And we explored a few other variations of that. Here's sort of this rainbowy thing in the sidebar, and here's another variation of that. But to us, it felt a little too opinionated. It felt like almost, unless your brand is like this visual, nicely represents your visual identity, it felt like a cheap gimmick to us. So we kept exploring from there. And another area we started exploring is like the sidebar area. Like, we saw more opportunities there. You can kind of see just a subtle way to introduce some of these visual gimmicks that I'm talking about. So here you can see kind of the sidebars kind of hugging the content area. Here's another version where the sidebar is kind of offset from the edges of the viewport, which is kind of a cool idea. Here's another one where it's kind of similar, where their content area is kind of offset from the edges of the viewport. And, that felt a little bit too busy for us, but it was kind of cool nonetheless. And, we even tried some simpler ideas where everything's just kind of flat in the background, but they just felt just a little too vanilla, a little too plain. But so where we landed was something, sort of a combination of a few of these ideas, where the sidebar is kind of in the background. It's sort of hugging the content area, and the background kind of gets extended across the top here. We like this because it was like a nice visual gimmick. It wasn't overly opinionated. You can still put any logo up in that top corner; it would still work. And we have we wanted to provide a darker version as well, just to, if you want something a bit more bold, you can try that as well. And what I really liked about this sort of treatment is you can carry it over to other areas of the UI. So we made these slide overs in this mobile nav. It's normally I go edge to edge on these components, but here it's a nice way to carry that visual gimmick over to these components as well. So it's always nice when you can find something that you can just carry out throughout a variety of different components on your app. So yeah, now one thing you might be thinking when you're looking at this, it looks very gray. looks like, it's black, white, and gray. And that was very intentional because again, we want it to be very flexible and it pretty much works with anything. But we still want to provide you with components for like all of the colors that Tailwind offers. So we wanted to provide you with all of these button options because, like Tailwind colors are not necessarily interchangeable because colors like blue, indigo, and red, they're inherently much darker than colors like yellow and lime and the cyan we have here. So you can't just use that like white text that we use on the darker buttons on these lighter buttons. You have to kind of do an inverted treatment. So we wanted to provide all of these components for you as well. And we got the dark mode versions as well, and we want to provide some badges as well. And if you incorporate this into here's a forms page we kind of have going on. And if you wanted to kind of incorporate those colors into it, you can do that this way. You can change the butt color. And if you feel like going ahead and going a bit further, you can customize like the toggle component and the checkbox, like a lot of the form elements. Maybe if you wanted to like add some color to the sidebar, you can go ahead and do that. Here's an orange version as well I played with, and it's kind of cool, I guess. So that's like a way you can be really aggressive with the color and you can bring it in. But I like to introduce the colors in a more subtle way too. Like I like using these badges a lot. Like so, for example, we have these sort of status badges on our dashboard screen, and you usually use these to these colors to sort of highlight the severity of these values. So often you use like green for something that's positive, and red for something negative, and yellow for something maybe that's like neutral or pending. But what I like to do, just to add my own flavor, is just sort of rotate that hue a little bit. So I can, I'm going to select these. I can do this in Figma with these selection colors. So, instead of a green, I can try sort of a nice lime, I'm going to do that. I'm going to change the text color there. Instead of red, I might want to maybe try pink. And I can change the text color for that as well. And then maybe instead of yellow, I can go to like an amber. And it still does the job of communicating what those values represent, but it just kind of adds a different vibe to it. So it's another cool way to use color. Like everyone just kind of defaults to, the very vanilla colors. And so this is a nice way to add your own flavor to it. So another thing I want to talk about is form design. Forms are like one of my favorite things to design when I'm designing an application UI. It's all the components. There's a lot more opportunities for like fine little details. Like I love trying to perfect like getting the perfect shadow on those inputs. And now my coworker James McDonald, who's here from Scotland today, he's really good at these details, and he's really inspired me in this stuff. And with his permission, I'm going to share some of his secrets on how he gets that perfect looking shadow. So I have a Tailwind play here. What one is it? Is it this one? Do we close my Tailwind play here? Is there more? Maybe just reopen the link that I sent you.
Yep, that's one way to do it, but then I got a Telegram history. Why is it full screen? I have this one.
Yep.
Can I just recreate this one for you really quick?
Sure, you just got to add a background and
I think otherwise I should.
make sure when I duplicate it, it gets put underneath kind of thing.
Like a border. What color did you use?
It was a gray 300.
All right. No problem, everybody. It's fine. Cool. So hopefully that's close enough. You might want space Y. Space Y saves me. Okay.
Apparently,
So many browser windows. Hard to keep track of everything. Maybe to access. Just gotta get it right.
yeah. Okay, so there we have an input, and this is how I used to design inputs. I would have like a border on there and make it gray 300, and I would just make it like a vertically offset shadow underneath to give it that depth, and it does a pretty good job. But when I started working with James and kind of seeing what he did, he works in Figma, and what he always did is he created an outer stroke on it, on the input, like a really dark one, and reducing the opacity to about 10%. Now, we can't create a stroke, per se, in the same way you can in Figma in CSS, but you can do that with Tailwind's ring utility. So I'm going to first duplicate this and have another one underneath, so we can kind of compare it after the fact. And then I'm going to remove this border, so I'm just going to make it border, get rid of that, and I'm going to add a 1 pixel ring to it. And then, like I said, I'm going to make it really dark. I'm going to make it ring gray 950. And then, so you have the dark border on there now, and I'm going to reduce the opacity to about 10%. So what you can kind of see there is what's happening there now is like that shadow is kind of getting exposed underneath that because you have the opacity on there. You can't do that with the border because the border is kind of on the inside of the input, so you can't really expose the shadow underneath it. And it just looks much more crisp, and like the top one here is looking a little bit muddy. Are you guys seeing the same thing? It looks very like muddy on my screen here compared to the bottom one. Now, it especially becomes noticeable when I change the background color here to like something pretty obvious, like gray 200. Now it's going to looking, that you can still maintain that contrast ratio on the bottom one because it has the opacity on it. But this top one's looking super muddy now. It's hard to see that border now. It's kind of clashes with the shadow a little bit. So that's a nice way to get like a really crisp looking shadow. Incredibly nerdy stuff. Where'd my Figma file go? Is that it? There it is. So we apply that same treatment to some of the other form elements, like the checkboxes and the toggles and the select menus. We really wanted to deviate from like native OS components and really have something that's really custom and polished and consistent with everything else. But we don't deviate entirely from native OS stuff. We really like to lean into some of the native OS patterns and conventions for like animations and interactive elements. So a good example of that is like on dropdown. So I'm going to show you kind of like where we mimic a native OS thing, and I'm going to, what do we got here for browsers here? So like if I look, can you see it? Yep, you can. If I show you what we can do on, if I go on like on the desktop here, if I show like a dropdown on Mac OS, you can see that it appears instantly, right? And the animation is sort of saved for when you click away. It does this little quick fade out there. And that's nice because it's like it doesn't interfere with your user experience. It's very instant when you're trying to find what you're looking for, but that delightful little animation is saved for after the fact. And we like that. What we like about that is that it's super subtle. It's like you almost don't even notice it, but it's just but you kind of do little details like that. They all add up after a while. So we apply that same treatment to our application. What are we using? Are we using Chrome to show the Brave. So we apply that same kind of thinking to our dropdowns here. Where do we have a dropdown on? We have it little here, same kind of thing. It's instant on click, but then when you click away, it does that little subtle fade out, right? Now, another area that we borrow from native OS is on the mobile experience. So, we, as like designers and developers, are always designing and creating these things on desktop computers, and oftentimes some mobile patterns kind of get overlooked as a result of that. So a good example of that is in dialogues, right? So I'm going to go to this orders page. I'm going to go to an order here. So on desktop, we often have like we treat dialogues, we set them in the middle of the viewport, right? And naturally, as we resize our browser, we just kind of keep it in that same position. But what we wanted to do, if you actually spend time like looking on your device and experience like dialogues, they usually like kind of animate up from the bottom, right? And that's a nice little detail that people don't consider when they're designing on desktop. So that way, when you're holding your device with one hand, you can reach those actions at the bottom. So we applied that same kind of thinking here. So when you get to the, when I click that now, it kind of animates up from the bottom here. Not resend, refund. There we go. So that's just a good example of where we kind of borrowed and we mimic the native OS style. So the last thing I want to talk about is dark mode. It's 2023 now, so it's like, there's. I just hit this and I put my arm down and I hit the button and I don't know what just happened there. Oof. What? I just hit Command Z and that solved that problem. What was I saying? Dark mode. It's only, there's not. You're most required to ship your apps with dark mode nowadays. So of course we wanted to include that as well. And every time I tweet about Tailwind colors, everyone's always asking if there's like some magical solution we could provide where if you make your light version, at the flick of a switch you can get your dark mode version. And that's obviously that would be awesome, but it's not coming anytime in the foreseeable future. And I can kind of explain why that might happen. Designing sites with dark mode for the past few years, like one thing I've kind of learned, it's very hard to do dark mode as an afterthought. And we kind of are embracing that now and treating dark mode as like completely separate artwork. So a good example to kind of explain why we need to do that. So take these buttons, for example. So the buttons on the left here, they all have a subtle shadow being cast off them. And it's kind of hard to see, but it's there. So just to give it some depth, right? But that shadow would essentially be invisible on dark mode because you have the dark on dark. So, but in order to get that same depth treatment, you can't rely on the absence light. You have to use like the surface of the button to create that like a reflective surface from the light source, right? So instead on dark mode, because we don't have the light background to cast a shadow onto, instead of doing like a gray blurred shape underneath or shadow casting up from the shadow, we do this sort of inner glow on top of the button to kind of give it that same depth. Well, that's just an example of where we have to sort of create new artwork, and there's many more things that you have to consider like that when you're making dark mode. Now, we don't deviate completely from, we do keep some things consistent when we do dark mode, and sort of explain that is, we try to maintain our depth cues. So to explain that, you can kind of see what I mean by that is like on this sidebar here, it's kind of like this off-white because it's in the background. It looks like it's further away, and the content area is very white, so it looks like it's closer to you. And we apply that same thinking when we do dark mode. So the sidebar, it's like the darker element. It's like further back, so we're using a gray 950 for that. And to make it look like the content area is a little closer to you, we make it the lighter color as well. Like many people think you simply need to invert the colors to kind of get the dark mode effect, but we kind of think about it in the opposite way when we're doing these background elements. So yeah. So that pretty much covers, that's like kind of a sneak peek at some of the design details we put into this thing. And Adam's going to take it back, and he's going to kind of show you how we built some of these details that I shared with you, plus a few more. So thanks.
Good job, buddy. All right. Cool. So, yeah, like Steve mentioned, I do have just like one cool trick that I wanted to show you guys. It's a really neat Tailwind trick related to how we kind of had to do one of these things. So let me navigate the hellacious stuff that we got here and see what I can do. So we're going to start this server. 3002. And we'll just keep it simple here. Okay, so the one that I want to show you guys that I think I get really excited about is the dialogue thing. So you might think that this is like kind of easy. Like it's just like responsive design or whatever, right? Like the dialogue's here and on mobile or whatever, it slides up from the bottom. And I kind of removed the code that made it slide up from the bottom so I can show you how to do it. But because we're using Framer Motion under the hood to do all this stuff, it really isn't that simple. And I think a lot of people's tendency is, because you have to kind of configure these transition animations in JavaScript, you end up reaching for JavaScript to try and measure the viewport, know which things you should add and stuff like that. And there's a way to do it with just totally vanilla CSS with Tailwind that I think is extremely clever that I want to show off. So let's think about what we need to do here. If we want to actually have this thing slide up from the bottom, why don't we just implement it statically first? So I'm going to have to just guess on some of these values, and we'll kind of figure it out as we go here. So by setting a Y offset, we can sort of say what should be happening to this dialog as it sort of animates in. So here I'm saying, if I've got this right, we'll have to test. I might have to add some negative signs or something here. But my goal here is to say, start the dialog shifted down 20 pixels from where it's sort of supposed to be, and then animate it back to the 0 position. So you can see that is kind of scaling up a little bit. Now let's move it to the bottom. So I'm going to get rid of this MY auto and just make it MT auto. And then maybe on non-mobile screens, so maybe we'll do it at SM, we'll add MB auto as well, so it goes back to the middle. So let's make it slide up a little bit more. Maybe we'll do 80 pixels or something. And I think we'll play with the scale too and get rid of that just so you can see. Okay, so that's sliding up now, but we don't want to do the scaling. Similarly, on desktop, we don't want to do the sliding. So how do we do this? How do we say only do one or the other depending on some sort of breakpointy type of thing? So the trick that I came up with for this is to do it with CSS variables and create those CSS variables using Tailwind's arbitrary properties, which is kind of some, the nuttiest stuff that you can do with Tailwind, basically. So let's start with the mobile one. So on mobile, we want it to scale from sort of 0%. So watch this. In square brackets, I'm just going to say scale from, and I'm just going to say 0%. No, scale from 100%. We want it to stay at 100% the whole time, and I want it to scale to 100%. So here we're basically just saying the scale shouldn't change, right? So remember 95%, please. That is your job. So we're going to set this to scale from. We're going to set this to scale to. We probably don't really need the scale to, I guess. 100 is going to be the same for both, but whatever. And let's just see, do we do this right? So in theory, this should still, or this should not scale now, right? So that's not scaling, it's just kind of sliding up. But that means on desktop, it's also not scaling, but we want it to scale. So rather than trying to sort of change these values based on their breakpoints, we can just redefine the variables based on the breakpoints, because we can combine arbitrary properties with modifiers in Tailwind. So let's redefine scale from to be 95% here. And now it's scaling. It's sliding up also, though, right? So how do we get rid of that? So on desktop, we don't want it to scale. So we're going to have to do the same sort of thing. So let's define some variables. So we're going to say slide from, say, 80 pixels. And this one, we'll just leave it at 0 pixels, whatever. So let's replace these 80 pixels with var slide from. And let's just go back to the mobile one, just make sure that's still, that didn't work. Sick. Let's try making it not a pixel value. Sometimes Framer Motion is picky about. Anyone see what I might be doing wrong? Do I need to do it in here too, you think? Slide from 80%. No, 80 pixels. Any syntax errors? Do we see any syntax errors? Yeah, I don't think that one should be a big deal. Not sliding. Oh, it slid down at the end. So that's interesting. So let's, I don't know. I don't know why that didn't work, but let's just try.
You might need variables everywhere for the other two as well.
You think so? Let's try it. Dude, every time I try and do this, I feel like I know exactly what I'm doing, and it ends up, I feel like it just changes. The code in node modules just changes, you know? So it's sliding down on close, but it's not sliding.
Yeah, you're going to use it now, right?
Yeah. But I don't think that's going to be it. Do you? Oh, yeah. Okay, so we got to use variables for everything. Obviously, I knew that. But now on desktop, it's still going to be sliding, which we don't want to do. So we can do the same sort of thing. So SM slide from, we'll just not slide from anything, and whatever, just to be super ultra clear, we'll slide to 0 pixels too. In theory, now it's just scaling on like desktop screens and just sliding on like mobile screens. So that is like pretty clever, like I think that's a really interesting way of using some of these features in Tailwind to do something that you might have like reached for like a resize observer and a bunch of like complex stuff for. It's always really satisfying to me when I can find like a way to do something with just CSS and not be responsible for any of the things that are broken with it. Instead, I can blame the people who work at Google for that. So anyways, that's all I wanted to show you guys. I thought that was kind of a cool, kind of advanced Tailwind trick to sort of finish off some of the stuff we've been sharing with. Again, I just kind of want to say, thank you to everyone for coming. This is like really cool. I'm super excited to meet everyone and get a chance to hang out. And we got a bunch of free pizza and free drinks and stuff. So like hang out and enjoy and get to know all the cool people who've traveled from all over the world to be here and be with other people who are super excited about Tailwind. At the very end of the night on your way out, we've got like swag bags at the back table with like t-shirt sizes labeled on all of them. Figured we'd do it that way so you don't have to carry them around the whole night, so you can just grab one on your way out. Also, there's beer glasses in every single one of them, so don't just grab the t-shirt out, or we're gonna have a big broken glass problem. But yeah, feel free to grab that on the way out, and hang out as long as you like. And if you have any questions, you want to chat about anything, just find me after, and I'm looking forward to connecting with everyone and meeting everyone. So thank you again to everyone for coming out to this. It's been awesome. Really appreciate you being here.